My name is Isabella Reyes, and on a Tuesday morning in October, I sat alone on a hard wooden bench in probate court, Department 4, preparing for my own execution. It was not an execution of the body, but of character, a public spectacle designed by my own family to strip me of my last connection to the only person who had ever truly seen me, my grandmother. The courtroom was a sterile, impersonal box, smelling of stale coffee and institutional floor polish. Sunlight struggled through the grimy windows, casting long, dusty shafts of light that seemed to illuminate nothing but our collective misery. On the other side of the aisle sat my family, a united front of greed and resentment. My father, Arthur Reyes, a man whose life was a monument to his own mediocrity, sat with his arms crossed, a smug smirk playing on his lips. Beside him, my mother, Martha, dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, a master class in performative grief. And then there was my younger brother, Leo, coddled and weak, looking thoroughly uncomfortable in a suit that was too expensive for him, his gaze shifting nervously around the room. They had a lawyer, a man named Davies with a shark smile and predatory eyes, who was currently shuffling a mountain of paperwork. They looked prepared. They looked confident. They were a pack, and they had scented blood. I, by contrast, had only a single, slim manila file resting on my lap. I had no lawyer. I had only the truth, a commodity that felt alarmingly devalued in this particular arena. The battle was over the estate of my grandmother, Ilara Reyes, a woman with a will as strong as the steel her late husband, a decorated colonel, had commanded. She had left her entire estate, a considerable portfolio and a beautiful historic home, to me, every last penny. Her final will and testament was not just a legal document, it was a declaration. It was her final, defiant act of love and validation in a family that had offered me neither. My parents, who had been banking on a generous inheritance to fund their comfortable lifestyle and bail Leo out of his latest failed business venture, were contesting the will. Their claim was as ludicrous as it was insulting, that my grandmother had been mentally incompetent, and that I, her estranged and mysterious granddaughter, had exerted undue influence over her in her final years. They were going to paint me as a villain, a manipulator, a ghost who had swooped in to steal what was rightfully theirs. I looked at their faces, so familiar and yet so alien. The years of quiet disapproval, of dismissive comments about my chosen career, of open favoritism towards Leo, had all led to this. This cold, sterile room where they would try to legally erase me from our family's history. I placed a hand over the file in my lap. My breathing was even, my heart rate steady. They thought this was their battlefield. They thought they held all the power. They had forgotten what my grandmother had always known. I was a soldier, and I had come prepared for war. The betrayal had been swift and absolute. The will reading had taken place in a stuffy lawyer's office just a week after we buried my grandmother. I had flown in on short notice, taking a precious few days of leave, my dress uniform packed away in favor of a simple black suit. My family had barely acknowledged my presence at the funeral, treating me like a distant, inconvenient relative. They assumed, as they always did, that my life was a transient, unimportant affair. The lawyer, a kind, elderly man who had served my grandmother for decades, read her final wishes in a quiet, solemn tone. The moment he announced that the entirety of the estate was bequeathed to me, Isabella Reyes, in recognition of her service, her strength, and for making an old woman profoundly proud, the room had erupted. My father had shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is preposterous," she was senile. "That woman," he had pointed a trembling finger at me, "she poisoned her mind against us." My mother had burst into theatrical sobs, crying about how they had been the ones to care for Ilara in her final months, a gross exaggeration of their weekly, perfunctory visits. Leo had just stared at me, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He had seen his easy life, funded by his grandmother's generosity, evaporating before his eyes. I had said nothing. I had simply sat there, clutching the small, antique locket my grandmother had given me years ago, the weight of her final gift and her final burden settling upon me. It was in that moment, seeing the raw, ugly greed on their faces, that I knew a fight was coming. They had filed the lawsuit within a week. Their legal petition was a work of fiction, a carefully crafted narrative of my supposed villainy. They painted me as a cold, absentee figure who had abandoned her family for a strange, secretive life. They twisted my infrequent visits, a necessity of my demanding career. into proof of my callousness. They claimed I had forbidden my grandmother from speaking to them, that I had systematically isolated her. Every line was a lie, a distortion designed to strip me of my legitimacy and my inheritance. I read the document in the quiet solitude of my quarters, thousands of miles away. The words were a physical assault, a character assassination penned by the very people who should have been my staunchest defenders. The pain was sharp and deep, a fresh wound on top of old scars. But as the initial shock subsided, it was replaced by something else, a cold, hard resolve. They had underestimated me my entire life. They had dismissed me, mocked me, and ignored me. Now they were trying to rob me. They had mistaken my quiet professionalism for weakness. They had mistaken my discipline for a lack of passion. They were about to learn, in the most public way imaginable, how grievously they had miscalculated. This wasn't about the money. It was about honor, my grandmother's and my own. The proceedings began. The judge, a man in his late 60s named Wallace Miller, entered the courtroom. He had a stern, impassive face and a reputation for being a stickler for the law. He looked over the courtroom with tired, cenotol eyes, and I knew this was just another Tuesday for him, another sad family squabble over money. My family's lawyer, Mr. Davies, rose to give his opening statement. He was smooth and eloquent, his voice resonating with false sympathy. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today to rectify a grave injustice. We are here to protect the legacy of Alara Reyes, a beloved matriarch whose final wishes were tragically distorted by the manipulative actions of one estranged family member." He gestured towards me without looking at me, as if I were a piece of unpleasant evidence. The plaintiffs, Arthur and Martha Reyes, along with their son, Leo, were Alara's constant companions, her caregivers, her confidants. They spent their lives by her side. And yet this will, a document drafted under suspicious circumstances, seeks to disinherit them entirely in favor of my client's sister, Ms. Isabella Reyes. He paused, letting the title Ms. hang in the air, a deliberate attempt to diminish me, to make me seem ordinary, unofficial. "Ms. Reyes," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "is a woman who, by her own choice, has not been a part of this family for many years. She leads a transient life, moving from place to place, with no permanent home, no stable career that we can ascertain. She would appear for brief, unannounced visits, and it was after one such visit that this new, shocking will was drafted." He paced before the judge's bench, a predator working the cage. "We will present evidence that Alara Reyes' mental state was in decline. We will show that Ms. Reyes systematically alienated her from her loving family. We will argue that Ms. Reyes is fundamentally unfit to act as executor of such a substantial estate. She has no financial experience, no ties to this community, no stability. To entrust Alara's legacy to her would be a gross dereliction of this court's duty." I listened to his words, a tapestry of lies woven so skillfully that they almost sounded plausible. He was good. He was creating a narrative, and in a courtroom, narrative is often more powerful than truth. I watched the judge's face. It remained impassive, unreadable. I looked at the jury box, not a jury, but the public gallery was filled with my parents' friends, their faces a mixture of pity for my parents and disdain for me. They were the jury of public opinion, and they had already reached their verdict. I was guilty. I kept my back straight, my hands resting on the file in my lap. Inside, a storm raged. But on the surface, I was a sea of calm. In my world, you never let the enemy see your fear. You never let them know they've hit their target. You hold your position, you weather the barrage, and you wait for the precise moment to strike back. And my moment was coming. Mr. Davies called his first witness, my father. Arthur Reyes walked to the witness stand with a practiced air of solemn dignity. He was playing the part of the grieving, wronged patriarch. Davies led him through a series of gentle questions, allowing him to paint a picture of a close, loving family that had been torn apart by a single, malevolent influence. "Me. Mr. Reyes," Davies said, his voice soft, "can you describe your relationship with your daughter, Isabella?" My father sighed a heavy, theatrical sound. "It's been difficult," he said, shaking his head sadly. "We love her, of course, she's our daughter, but she was always different. Ambitious in a way that was, well, it wasn't family-oriented. She chose a life that took her far away from us. We barely saw her. A phone call on Christmas, maybe a postcard from some godforsaken place. We never knew where she was or what she was doing. And your mother, Alara, how did he feel about this?" "She was heartbroken," my father said, his voice cracking. She wanted all her family around her. She never understood why Isabella would choose to stay away. In her last few years, she got confused. Isabella would show up, and after she left, my mother would be agitated, upset. It's our belief that Isabella used these visits to poison her mind against us. It was a masterful performance. He was twisting my grandmother's pride in my career into confusion, and my duty-bound absences into neglect. Davies then moved in for the kill. Mr. Reyes, the will names Isabella as the sole executor. Do you believe she is capable of handling such a responsibility? My father chuckled, a short, bitter sound that was utterly dismissive. Capable? Your Honor, with all due respect, my daughter is a ghost. She has no address, no real job that anyone can understand, no assets. We, her family, have no idea how she even supports herself. He leaned forward, his voice filled with scornful pity. She has nothing, Dad, Mocked, the words echoing in the quiet courtroom. She owns nothing. She has no roots. She drifts through life. My wife and I, on the other hand, have managed our finances for 40 years. My son, Leo, is a businessman. We are the responsible ones. To give my mother's estate to Isabella would be like giving a child a loaded gun. It's irresponsible. It's dangerous. He sat back, his testimony complete. He had portrayed me as a penniless, unstable drifter, a person of no consequence or substance, a nothing. And he had done it under oath with a smug certainty that no one could contradict him. He glanced over at me, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He thought he had just won. He had no idea he had just handed me the ammunition I needed to destroy his entire case. A ripple of condescending laughter and sympathetic murmurs went through my parents' supporters in the gallery. They nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the scorn my father had just so eloquently expressed. They saw me as he did, a strange, wayward woman who was trying to steal from her decent, hard-working family. The sound was a fresh wave of humiliation, but I absorbed it, converted it into fuel. Judge Miller banged his gavel once, a sharp crack that cut through the noise. Order, he commanded, his voice flat. This is a courtroom, not a theater. But the sentiment lingered in the air. The narrative was set. I was the villain, the outcast, the nothing. My father stepped down from the stand, avoiding my gaze, and returned to his seat next to my mother, who squeezed his hand in a gesture of proud solidarity. Leo gave me a small, triumphant smirk from across the aisle. They were so certain of their victory. They had laid their trap, and they believed I had walked right into it, unarmed and alone. Davies looked at the judge. The plaintiff rests its case for now, Your Honor. Judge Miller turned his gaze to me. Ms. Reyes, he said, his tone suggesting he was merely going through the motions. You are representing yourself. Do you wish to make an opening statement or call a witness? I rose slowly to my feet. The room was silent, all eyes on me. They were expecting tears or an angry, rambling defense. They were expecting the emotional outburst of a cornered animal. I gave them none of that. I stood tall, my posture perfect, my hands steady. Your Honor, I said, my voice clear and calm, carrying to every corner of the room without any effort. I will not be calling any witnesses. I find I do not need to. However, before I make my statement, I would like to submit a document to the court. I picked up the single manila file from my table. The plaintiff has made several claims regarding my character, my stability, my financial standing, and my overall fitness to execute the will of my grandmother, Ilara Reyes. I believe this document will provide the necessary clarification on those points. I felt my family's eyes on me, a mixture of curiosity and amusement. A single file. What could possibly be in that one file that could undo the damning picture they had just painted? They were about to find out. I walked to the front of the courtroom, my steps measured and even. The quiet click of my heels on the linoleum floor was the only sound. I did not look at my family. I did not look at their lawyer. I looked only at the judge. I handed the file to the bailiff, a burly man who looked at me with an expression of mild pity. For the judge, I said quietly. The bailiff carried the file up to the bench and placed it before Judge Miller. My family watched, whispering amongst themselves, their expressions still radiating smug confidence. Leo leaned over and said something to my father, who snorted with derisive laughter. They thought this was my last pathetic gambit. A bank statement, perhaps. A character reference from some unknown employer. They had no frame of reference for the life I had built, for the person I had become. Judge Miller P. picked up the file, his expression one of weary impatience. He opened it. I watched his face. For a long moment he was still, his eyes scanning the top page. Then I saw it. A subtle shift. his eyebrows raised slightly. He read on, turning to the second page, then the third. The weariness in his expression evaporated, replaced by something else entirely. It was a look of profound, unadulterated shock. His posture straightened. He was no longer slouching in his chair. He was sitting at rigid attention. His gaze flickered up from the papers and locked onto me. And in that moment, the entire dynamic of the room changed. He was no longer looking at Ms. Reyes, the defendant. He was looking at me, Isabella Reyes, and for the first time, he was truly seeing me. The file contained my entire unredacted military service record. It detailed every promotion, every command, every deployment to the most dangerous and politically sensitive regions in the world. It listed the medals for valor, the commendations for distinguished service, the letters of recognition from senators and foreign dignitaries. And on the final page, it showed my current rank, my current command, and the immense budget I was responsible for, a budget that dwarfed my grandmother's estate by a factor of 1,000. It contained my truth. The judge slowly, deliberately, closed the file. The sound of the cover tapping against the wood of his bench was unnaturally loud in the silent room. He cleared his throat. He looked from the file, back to me, and then he did something that no one in that room could have ever predicted. He stood up. The sight of a judge rising to his feet while court is in session is a rare and powerful thing. It signals a moment of profound significance, a departure from all normal protocol. A wave of confusion washed over the courtroom. My family stopped whispering. Their smirks faltered. Mr. Davies, their lawyer, looked utterly bewildered, half rising from his chair as if to object, though he had no idea what he would be objecting to. Judge Wallace Miller stood at his full height, his black robes giving him the appearance of an avenging angel. He was no longer just a judge. He was a man possessed of a sudden, powerful conviction. He looked directly at me, and his eyes, which had been so tired and impassive, were now sharp and clear, filled with a look of unmistakable, profound respect. My file had told him more than just my rank. It had told him who I was. I knew from my research that he had served 20 years in the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps, retiring as a colonel. He was a man who understood the chain of command. He understood the meaning of sacrifice and the weight of responsibility. And he was now looking at a woman who outranked him by 3 stars. His next words were not directed at the court, but at me and me alone. His voice was not the gravelly tone of a judge, but the clear, crisp voice of a military officer. "General Reyes," he said. The title, spoken with such reverence, struck the room like a lightning bolt. General. Not Ms. Reyes, General. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's face went slack, the color draining from it. Leo froze, his smug expression replaced by one of dawning, abject horror. Then Judge Miller did the unthinkable. He squared his shoulders, brought his right hand up in a flawless textbook motion, and delivered a sharp, formal salute. The sound of his hand connecting with his brow was a crack of thunder in the stunned silence. He held it for a beat, a gesture of ultimate respect from one soldier to another, an acknowledgement of rank, service, and sacrifice that transcended the petty squabbles of this civilian courtroom. In that single, silent gesture, my family's entire case, their carefully constructed world of lies and condescension, was utterly and irrevocably annihilated. The salute ended. Judge Miller lowered his hand and sat back down, but the man who had risen was not the same man who resumed his seat. The tired arbiter was gone, replaced by a commander with a new and focused mission, to dispense justice. He fixed my father and his lawyer with a glare of pure ice. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Mr. Davies," the judge said, his voice low and menacing, a controlled fury that was far more terrifying than any shout. "Your client, Mr. Arthur Reyes, has testified under oath in my courtroom. He has characterized his daughter, a decorated general officer of the United States Armed Forces, as having nothing. He has called her unstable, irresponsible, and a drifter." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "A woman who, according to this file, has successfully managed logistical operations and personnel numbering in the tens of thousands in active war zones. A woman entrusted by our government with matters of national security." He picked up his gavel, holding it like a weapon. "It would appear," he continued, his voice dangerously quiet, "that your client has not only lied about his daughter's character, but has done so in a manner so egregious that it borders on perjury. And I can assure you, counsel, I do not take kindly to perjury in my courtroom." Mr. Davies was speechless. His face was pale, his professional confidence shattered. He looked at my father, who seemed to have shrunk in his chair, his smugness replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. They had walked into a courtroom, but they had just found themselves on a battlefield, outmaneuvered, outgunned, and facing a commander who held their fate in his hands. The judge turned his attention back to me, his expression softening immediately. "General Reyes," he said, the respect still evident in his voice. "Please proceed with your statement." I walked to the podium, the silence in the room now one of rapt, fearful attention. My parents' friends were no longer looking at me with disdain, but with a mixture of shock and awe. I was no longer the villain. I was a mystery they were desperate to understand. I looked at my family one last time. I saw the fear in their eyes, the dawning, sickening realization of who they had tried to destroy, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty pity for them. Then I began to speak. My statement was not long, nor was it emotional. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of a commander briefing her troops. I laid out the facts, one by one, like perfectly aligned pieces on a chessboard. "Your Honor," I began, "the plaintiff's case rests on two fundamental falsehoods. The first is that my grandmother, Alara Reyes, was mentally incompetent. The second is that I am an unstable and unfit individual who manipulated her." I addressed the first point swiftly, presenting my grandmother's detailed medical records and sworn affidavits from her doctors, all of which confirmed she had been of perfectly sound mind until the day she died. I presented letters and emails she had sent me, lucid, funny, and sharp, written just weeks before her passing. The narrative of the confused old woman crumbled into dust. Then I addressed the second point, my own character. "My father testified that I have nothing," I said, my gaze sweeping over him. He flinched as if struck. "He is correct in a way. I do not own a large house. I do not have a portfolio of stocks. My life is not measured in material possessions. My life is measured in service." I briefly and without embellishment outlined the nature of my work. I did not speak of battles or heroics. I spoke of responsibility, of logistics, of managing billion-dollar budgets, of leading thousands of men and women who depended on my judgment for their very lives. I spoke of a life dedicated to my country, a path my grandmother, the proud wife of a colonel, had understood and championed. "My grandmother did not see my life as unstable," I said, my voice softening for the first time. "She saw it as honorable. She did not feel I was absent. She understood I was deployed. This will was not the result of manipulation. It was the final act of a woman who valued courage and duty above all else. She left her estate to me not because she disdained the rest of her family, but because she knew I would be a faithful steward of her legacy. It is a trust I will not betray." I concluded by looking directly at the judge. "The plaintiff's case is built on greed and a profound ignorance of a life they never bothered to understand. It is without merit. I ask the court to dismiss it and to honor the final, sacred wishes of Alara Reyes." I then returned to my seat. The silence in the room was absolute. I had not presented an argument. I had presented a reality so powerful and undeniable that it had bulldozed their entire mountain of lies. The unraveling was swift and brutal. Judge Miller turned to Mr. Davies. "Counsel," he said, his voice dripping with acid, "do you have any response to the general's statement or the evidence she has presented?" Davies, looking utterly defeated, stood on shaky legs. "Your Honor, we were not aware of the full extent of MS, of General Reyes's career." "Clearly," the judge snapped. "Perhaps if your clients had spent less time plotting to take her inheritance and more time acting like a family, this whole charade could have been avoided. Do you wish to recall Mr. Reyes to the stand?" Davies looked at my father, who was shaking his head frantically, his face ashen. The last thing he wanted was to face the judge's questions now that his lies had been so thoroughly exposed. "No, Your Honor," Davies mumbled. "Then I will render my judgment." Judge Miller looked out over the courtroom, his gaze sweeping over my family with undisguised contempt. "This court has heard a petition to invalidate the will of Alara Reyes based on claims of incompetence and undue influence. The evidence has shown, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that these claims are not only baseless, but are a malicious and greedy fabrication." He looked directly at my father. "This court is appalled by the testimony of Mr. Arthur Reyes, who, under oath, deliberately misrepresented his daughter's character and life's work in an attempt to defraud her of her rightful inheritance. It is a shameful display, not only of familial betrayal, but of profound disrespect to an individual who has dedicated her life to the service of this nation. He picked up his gavel. Therefore, the petition is dismissed with prejudice. The last will and testament of Alara Reyes is declared valid and binding. All costs associated with this frivolous lawsuit will be borne by the plaintiffs. He brought the gavel down with a final, echoing crack. This court is adjourned. It was over. The gavel's fall was the sound of a door slamming shut on a lifetime of disrespect. My family sat frozen in their seats, stunned into silence by the totality of their defeat. They had come to court expecting to beggar me. Instead, they had been bankrupted, morally, publicly, and now legally. As the courtroom began to empty, my family remained in their seats, a small island of wreckage in the emptying room. Their lawyer, Mr. Davies, gathered his papers with frantic, clumsy movements, avoiding their eyes. He gave me a wide berth as he practically fled the courtroom, his reputation undoubtedly tarnished by his association with such a disastrous case. Finally, my family stirred. They saw me standing alone by my table, preparing to leave. My father, his face a mess of desperation and disbelief, was the first to approach. "Isabella," he stammered, his voice hoarse. I didn't know, you never told us." "You never asked," I replied, my voice quiet but firm. There was no anger left, only a vast, tired emptiness. My mother came next, her manufactured tears now horribly real. "My baby," she sobbed, reaching for my arm. "We can fix this, we're a family." I gently pulled my arm away. "No, Mom, we are not. A family does not do this to one another." Leo hung back, his face pale and slack with shock. He looked at me as if he were seeing a complete stranger, the alien creature who had just dismantled his entire world. He couldn't meet my eyes. I looked at the three of them, the people who had given me life but had never given me a home. I saw them for what they were, small, frightened people, trapped in a world of appearances and entitlements, incapable of understanding a life built on honor and sacrifice. In that moment, I could have said 1,000 things. I could have raged, I could have gloated, I could have demanded an apology. But what was the point? The war was over. I had won. But the victory felt hollow, the spoils nothing more than the sad confirmation of what I had known all along. I was an orphan with living parents. So I said nothing at all. I gave them one last, long look, a look of finality, of closure, of goodbye. Then I turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them behind with the ruins of their own making. I did not look back. 6 months later, I stood on the wide, wraparound porch of my grandmother's house. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the ancient oak trees she had loved so much, dappling the lawn in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. The house was quiet, filled with the lingering spirit of her strength and love. I hadn't sold it. I couldn't. It was more than a house. It was a sanctuary, a testament to the one person who had always been my anchor. I had used a portion of the inheritance to establish the Alara Reyes Foundation, a charitable trust dedicated to providing support and scholarships for the families of deployed service members. It was a legacy she would have been proud of, a way to transform her gift into something that would continue to serve others, just as I had. I rarely stayed at the house myself. My life was still one of motion and duty. But whenever I had leave, I came here. It was the only place that had ever felt like home. I had received a single, stilted letter from my father, full of excuses and self-pity. I never replied. My brother had sent a furious, rambling email accusing me of destroying the family. I deleted it without a second thought. My mother had tried to call several times, but I did not answer. The lines of communication were severed, the bridges burned. It was a necessary amputation, a painful but vital step to save myself from their lifelong poison. There was a lingering sadness, a quiet grief for the family I wished I'd had, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of peace. My victory in that courtroom wasn't about the money or the house. It was about reclaiming my own story. It was about standing in my own truth, a truth that my family had tried to deny and bury. My grandmother had given me the means, but my life, my service, my own hard-earned honor had given me the strength. I wah. Elkhead inside and picked up a silver-framed photograph from the mantelpiece. It was a picture of my grandmother and me, taken on the day I had graduated from the academy. She was beaming, her arm around my uniformed shoulders, her eyes shining with a fierce, unconditional pride. In her, I had found all the family I ever truly needed. The inheritance she left me wasn't just financial. It was the freedom to finally, completely be myself. And that was a gift beyond any price.